Before the first match was ever struck on a winter morning, mountain dwellers had already figured out how to stay warm without one. Imagine pressing your hand against a log wall that is nearly 16 inches thick, sealed with a mixture of fermented horsehair and lime, stuffed with raw wool that still smells faintly of lanolin and open pasture. The temperature outside is 40 below zero. Inside it is survivable. No fire, no fuel, just ancient engineering that modern construction has almost completely forgotten. This is not folklore. This is the forgotten science of pre-industrial mountain survival, and it worked with a precision that would humble most architects alive today. Here is where modern building fails in the cold and ancient building does not. Today, most homes are framed with thin timber studs, wrapped in synthetic insulation, and covered in lightweight cladding. The walls are thin. They respond immediately to outside temperatures, losing their heat almost as fast as it is generated. In extreme mountain cold, that kind of wall is a liability. Medieval and Scandinavian mountain builders understood something different. They chose old-growth pine and spruce, trees that had grown slowly for decades, producing dense, tight-grained wood with very little moisture trapped inside. The logs they selected for cabin walls were commonly 10 to 16 inches thick. That is not an accident. That mass is the machine. A thick log wall does not simply block cold. It absorbs energy slowly and releases it slowly, functioning like a thermal battery that charges during the warmer parts of the day and discharges through the long, frozen night. But mass alone means nothing if the cold finds a way inside. And it always finds a way inside, through the gaps. Every place two logs rest against each other is a potential thermal bridge, a narrow channel where freezing mountain air can push through and strip the warmth from the interior like a slow leak from a tire. The builders knew this. So before a single piece of insulation was placed, the logs themselves were shaped. The technique is called scribe-fit joinery. Each log was individually carved along its underside to follow the exact contour of the log resting beneath it. No two joints were the same. No standard gap was left open. It was painstaking, slow work, the kind of work that took real skill. But it meant that once those logs were stacked, they sat tight against each other in a way that modern machine-cut timber simply cannot replicate. Even with scribe-fit joinery, there were still gaps. Wood moves, it dries and contracts, it shifts with the seasons. So into those gaps went raw sheep's wool, not cleaned, not processed, not treated. Raw, straight from the animal, still carrying its natural lanolin coating. That lanolin matters more than most people realize. It is naturally water-resistant, which means the wool could manage moisture without collapsing or losing its loft. And loft is everything in insulation. What traps heat is not the fiber itself. It is the dead air caught inside the fiber. Under a microscope, raw wool looks like a coiled, scaly rope. Those scales create thousands of tiny pockets that lock still air in place. And, honestly, still air is one of the best insulators that exists. Modern fiberglass insulation tries to achieve the same thing with synthetic strands, but it lacks the self-regulating moisture properties that wool carries naturally. When fiberglass gets damp, it loses efficiency. Raw wool can absorb nearly a third of its own weight in moisture before its thermal performance begins to drop. The builders press this wool tightly into every primary timber joint, working it deep into the seams by hand, compressing it just enough to fill the void without crushing the air pockets that made it valuable. It was not decorative, it was structural survival. Once the wool was placed, the builders moved to the outer layer, and this is where the chemistry becomes genuinely fascinating. The chinking mixture used across medieval European and Scandinavian mountain traditions was not simple mud or clay. It was a carefully prepared compound that modern builders have almost no equivalent for. The base was lime putty, calcium hydroxide produced by burning limestone and mixing it with water. On its own, lime sets hard and rigid, which creates a problem. Log walls move. They settle and shift as the wood continues to dry, and as temperature changes cause the timber to expand and contract. A rigid seal cracks under that movement, and a cracked seal lets cold air in. So the builders added horsehair, not fresh horsehair, fermented horsehair, soaked and aged until its surface broke down slightly, roughening the fibers so they could bond into the lime matrix more effectively. The horsehair acted as a tension-binding agent throughout the mixture, absorbing the stress of movement and preventing the chinking from fracturing. Sometimes sand, or finely ground clay, was added to control the texture. Sometimes moss was pressed in as a secondary buffer layer beneath the lime coat. What this mixture created was something that could breathe. Lime is naturally vapor permeable, which means the wall could release moisture outward without trapping it inside the structure where it would cause rot or mold. But it was dense and airtight enough to block the wind wash, the penetrating movement of cold air along the exterior surface that strips heat from walls through convection. The outer lime coat stopped that stripping effect and preserved the thermal envelope that the wool and the mass had built up inside. By the time the exterior chinking was applied and cured, the cabin had become something remarkable. The walls were not just barriers, they were participants in the thermal system. During daylight hours, even the weak winter sun in mountain elevations transferred some energy into those dense log walls. Body heat from the occupants, even the warmth of breath and movement, was absorbed into the mass and held there. The wool joints prevented that absorbed energy from leaking outward. The lime surface prevented the wind from stripping what little warmth clung to the outer wall. Through the night, the stored energy released slowly inward, gradually, steadily, not as a blast of heat from a fire, but as a sustained, quiet exhale of warmth that could carry the interior temperature above freezing for hours, sometimes for an entire night, without a single log burned. Documented accounts from Scandinavian and Alpine communities describe this experience directly. Travelers who sheltered in these structures during blizzards often noted the surprising comfort inside compared to the violence of the storm outside. The walls did not feel warm to the touch, but the air inside was breathable, stable, and survivable in a way that a modern, thin-framed building, even with a heater, often is not, because modern buildings lose their heat the moment the fuel source fails. What these mountain builders understood intuitively, modern building science is only beginning to rediscover. High-density natural insulation actually outperforms synthetic alternatives in real-world conditions that involve moisture, temperature fluctuation, and, long-duration cold exposure. Lime-based breathable plasters are now being reintroduced in sustainable construction because, they manage moisture better than cement renders. Wool insulation products are returning to the market after decades of being dismissed in favor of cheaper synthetic options. But beyond the materials, the deeper lesson is about the philosophy of how a structure should work. These cabins did not fight the cold. They absorbed it slowly, stored warmth carefully, and released it deliberately. They worked with the physics of the mountain environment rather than simply trying to overpower it with fuel consumption. That kind of thinking, that patient, material-aware approach to energy, is honestly exactly the sort of intelligence that modern eco-home design is searching for. Passive house principles, thermal mass construction, breathable natural building systems, all of them really, trace a direct line back to the hands that pressed raw wool into a log joint on a freezing alpine morning, about 800 years ago. The next time you walk into a well-heated room, Just consider what happens the moment that heat source is removed. For most modern structures, the answer is pretty simple: rapid heat loss and a race against the cold. But for those mountain cabins sealed with fermented horsehair and raw lanolin wool, the answer was different. The walls held, the mass held, the envelope held. Those builders left no blueprints, no patents, no instruction manuals. They left only the structures themselves, some of which are remarkably still standing. Silent proof that survival does not always require more technology. Sometimes it just requires a deeper understanding of the materials already around you. If this kind of forgotten knowledge fires something in you, then, well, you are exactly where you need to be. Like this video, share it with someone who would appreciate the depth of what history still has to teach us, and subscribe to The Survival Historian, because this is only one thread in a much larger story of human endurance, ingenuity, and the will to survive against every odd that nature presents.